The Innovation Show is brought to you by Gate One and Gate One Incubator that supports its team to become founder investors in a growing portfolio of startup opportunities. You can find Gate One at gateoneconsulting.com. In Chapter 5 of The Corporate Explorer, Binns, Tushman and O'Reilly share how a corporate explorer created a new business inside the consulting and accounting firm Deloitte. His new unit, Deloitte Pixel, uses the wisdom of the crowds to solve complex management problems. His first experience of the power of the crowds came when he was part of a self-organized community that came together to provide relief for victims of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. This gave him a taste that communities of people could self-organize and do work that traditional organization structures might struggle to perform. He then started to apply similar principles of wisdom of the crowds to management consulting. It is a great pleasure to welcome that very corporate explorer, joined by his friend Andrew Binns. Balaji, Bondili and Andrew Binns, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Aidan. Thank you for having me.
Hey, Aidan, how you doing?
I thought, Balaji, before I come to you, I'd come to Andy to give context to you from his perspective, because we love people who work in innovation and work in consulting and innovation, love Balaji's, because there's so many stories of this not working out. I was a failed corporate explorer myself, where I just couldn't get the organization to get it over the line, made multiple mistakes that it appears that you didn't make. And before I come to you and the origin stories of the inkling of that idea that I mentioned in the introduction, I thought it'd come to Andy first. And Andy, maybe you'd give your introduction to Balaji.
Thank you, Aidan. Yeah, I'm delighted to do so. Corporate explorers are people who see a customer problem in the world, something they have passion personally about, just like an entrepreneur. And then they convert that insight, that passion, into a business concept. And very often it falls. And a few succeed. And what Corporate Explorer is about is learning from people like Balaji to kind of explain what makes the difference. And I think you're going to hear the difference. The difference is a lot to do with the depth of that passion, firstly, that understanding and commitment, then his commitment to learning. And in the book, I use this phrase that which I borrow from Balaji: what needs to be true for my business to succeed, right? This tees up this whole notion of experimentation. What needs to be true? And then the next piece, which we actually don't tell in the book because it's happened since, is the way that Balaji builds what Mike Tushman calls a social movement or a leadership movement around the idea, so that there's support in the business in order for him to then take it to scale. And I think this sort of is one of those stories that really helps us to see what is possible for a corporate explorer to achieve. So it's great to have you here, Balaji.
Yeah, it was so great to have you, Balaji. And it's great to have the example, as I said. And I wanted to come to a couple of things, Balaji. First is, there are so many people who listen to this show who are potential corporate explorers. But when they look ahead and they close their eyes, and the third eye, they see the possible obstacles and struggles that it will take to bring this new idea to life, they just go, I couldn't be bothered. And for whatever reason, as I mentioned there in the introduction, you had this idea, the ingredients came together, they marinated over time, and you brought it to life. What was it that actually made you go, I'm going to go for this? There had to be some factor that helped you get it over the line.
One of the aspects that is underappreciated when we talk about businesses built within large companies is the individual's motivations. Like my own reasons as to why I needed that to work, as much as Deloitte needed it to work. I've been a career consultant, traveling around the world and serving all of our clients, literally spending weeks and months away from family, away from friends. I had a personal motivation to not do that anymore. And I wanted to be at the firm that I loved and I enjoyed, without having the only option to serve my firm and my clients as this in-person, road warrior. So when I reflected on what is the best way to continue to serve the clients and solve the problems that we do while staying put at home and hanging out with my friends and family, I had to come up with a different model that is both valuable to me and valuable to the firm. So this was as much my own personal need to create this, which drove me to do it. So that's my own reason. And second, when I saw the struggles that we were having as we were transitioning to an analytics intensive, AI intensive business, we just didn't have the people that we need, which was creating top line impact. We couldn't grow as fast as we could. And second, it was creating a lot of pressure on people because we have a data science project in Minneapolis. Somebody from San Francisco had to travel there, right? So I had to marry these two to say, is there a way that we can get work done where people around the world can participate in it? Which means if people around the world are participating in it, I don't have to be at the client delivering it, right? So bringing both of these together came up with the idea called Deloitte Pixel, which was bringing the ability of people around the world to solve client problems while creating the dependency and consistency of the firm and bringing creativity and optionality of the crowd. So it was a combination of my own need and the needs of the firm.
It's really interesting, isn't it, gentlemen, that when we look at startups, the conversation always gravitates to the role of the entrepreneur. Steve Jobs was such a phenomenal personality. Jeff Bezos and his astonishing insight to be able to build Amazon in the way that he did, or even, Elon Musk, God help us. And these personalities are what we explain the entrepreneur. But in corporations, we say, oh, well, what we need here is a structure, an ambidextrous structure, or we need a process for innovation. Now, I make fun of those. I make a fair amount of money putting those in place, right? So it's sort of the real secret. Those things matter, but the thing that makes the difference is the depth of commitment. As Balaji says, this matters to him. And if you look at the others in my book, it matters to Christian Kurtish at Unico. It matters to Yuki Matsuoka at Panasonic. It's like a personal crusade that she is on. And it's very individual in that sense, these motivations, just like an entrepreneur. And I think what's interesting is that's a question then for corporations. How do you let that come forward in the right way?
When I talk to startup companies that my friends are starting, one of the reasons you hear, even in startups or in large companies, there's a lot of burnout because they haven't really accounted for their own personal needs, their own passion as a design principle into the business that they're building. So at some point in time, they kind of diverge. The company is growing too fast and they're not feeling the success of it. They're feeling more of the stress of it because they haven't actually structured in their perspective into the business model. It is the entrepreneur's preferred lifestyle, preferred reasons to it has to become a part of the business model. Otherwise, it doesn't work for the person. And we all know lots of entrepreneurs that have 1% equity and have the pains of this being the CEO of a large startup. I didn't want to do that. Even as a company, this has to work for me as well as the company.
You've both kind of alluded to the idea of what's the carrot for the corporate explorer, because that's a really important thing. Because what I mean is, I'm working in an organization, I'm getting paid. For me now to become a corporate explorer, I'm taking on not just the potential of getting an idea like Pixel over the line, but the political turmoil that I'll have to go through in order to achieve that I believe you've done really well, Balaji. So what was it that was the carrot above and beyond the idea that this was a personal mission? And maybe what was the organization doing in order for you to go for it?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a methodology or a framework that Deloitte uses. It's called business chemistry, where you can answer a set of questions and it'll tell you across 4 categories of attitudes or persona where you fit in. And the four categories are you could be a guardian that loves rules, wants to stick to rules. You're an integrator that brings people together and gets stuff done. You're a driver that is always thinking about forward progress. And the fourth is pioneer, which is somebody that likes the ambiguity of building businesses. And the reason I bring those four archetypes of people is because a carrot is different for each of them. For me, the carrot is not doing the same thing I've been doing for a long time. Second, the biggest carrot for me is I feel like I need to own something that I have built. My ego needs that while also needing a steady paycheck. So that's the fact that I had the option to do and build my own is the biggest carrot for me. And to be allowed to do that, I'm willing to take on all the friction of politics of the large company. That's the fundamental. And of course, then it is my job to figure out what is the messages that the company needs to hear, what is the value that the company needs to get, so that I'm able to do what I want to do and build what I need to build. Because it would be a lot more suffocating for me to be, just running the grind in the exploit part of the organization versus the friction of the explore part of the organization.
Andy and I were nodding there when you were saying about the getting bored with the exploit, and I see that so much as a characteristic of so many of the audience of this show and so many corporate explorers, is that once it gets to a point of scale, it's kind of becomes an Excel job, or it's a line item in a repeatable, reliable revenue stream, and it becomes kind of boring and it loses its appeal to the corporate explorer as well. And that's exactly where I was going with the characteristics, because the characteristics of the corporate explorer are often that kind of, I want to build something which suggests you're creative and you want to see something brought forth in the world. Andy, what are your, I mean, you have been a corporate explorer. Also, you've also seen, Balaji mentioned there, the pioneers, but the pioneers take the arrows. And as your colleague, Carol Kovac, discovered, that is very, very true as well.
So that's right. There is something about an explorer, corporate explorer, an entrepreneur that is similar, which is this, ability, this magnetic compulsion to explore, to do new things, right? And some talk about it as being sort of low S-curve behavior, right? In the sense of the growth and maturity of a business. Some of us are just more attracted to the early stages. Now, what's interesting is that you also can have a phenomenon that where the explorers actually pull back at the moment at which something goes to scale, right? That they will go up and up the S-curve, and the moment at which you need to invest and stabilize the business in order to take it to scale, they pull back and say, well, no, maybe we're not serious. Let's go do something else, right? And so I have a client, a very large client, where there's a very large number of people who are this profile. And for me, it explains some of their repeating problems with scaling phenomenal innovations that they have, is that they have so many people who kind of approach this moment and then pull back. And so there's also this piece where you need, and Balaji called them integrators, you need people who are going to then pick up the baton at the next step in the relay race, right? So although some corporate explorers are just at the beginning, and some go all the way through that S-curve. So if you look at, in the book, we talk about Jim Peck at LexisNexis Risk, building this multi-billion-dollar risk analytics business. And he went on to be CEO of that. He's now on his third gig as a CEO, right? So he's clearly somebody who was low S-curve and can move take the business to scale. But sometimes you have to change. And it's kind of okay. It can be a relay race. An example of that would be at Best Buy, where Best Buy Health has gone from this kind of nascent idea, testing out the boundaries of what it might do in healthcare, finding some interesting things. And then in comes Deborah DeSanzi, and she makes the place go on fire. She turns it from a nascent idea into a really charging ahead business with some the sort of insight, energy and passion that she brings. So it's never just one story, I think, is what I'd say.
Yeah, to add to that, Andy, if I reflect on one thing that one thing that I try not to do is the initial idea is also the end state, which means the one way to keep your motivation up and increasing the value to the firm is to keep scaling the ambition of what you are trying to do. For example, when I started with Pixel, it was purely just crowdsourcing, competitive crowdsourcing. And then over a period of time, we added freelance marketplaces, or the time we added any external worker, or the time we added profitability, actually building true different business models where non-employees were like a huge component. I think allowing for that, the company has to allow for that idea to evolve versus almost I many times I request companies and my fellow innovators to think less about an idea versus more about a market, so that you don't pigeonhole yourself into one business model canvas, versus expand, allow pivots into wherever, however is the ability to bring that market to bear for your company.
This is almost like a different model of innovation than the traditional one that many corporations have had. Last week, I was in the Midwest with a very large industrial company, a fabulous innovation story that we all know, which I can't name, and they've kind of lost their way, and they've lost their way partly because they used to have a model with lots of technical innovation, lots of ideas, and then they'd find out where it mattered and what problem it solved. And some smart management consultant came along, probably the firm I used to work for, and said, "Oh, well, have you noticed you're making most of your profit from 10% of your products? You should cut all the rest of this other stuff." And guess what? Product launches collapse, right? And they have no system of innovation to replace the old system. And so part of what I think Balaji's just described is the alternative. And the alternative is, don't go looking for ideas, go looking for problems in markets. Go understand where you're hunting, find problems, and keep iterating the solution to those problems. And you'll find bigger opportunities as you do. And it becomes additive rather than just about proving that you're right. Now, interestingly, this is a little different than the entrepreneur mentality. Entrepreneurs, in this generation at least, tend to be quite narrow. They tend to be quite narrow because their exit is to a corporate. And a corporate needs to be able to understand and value the point technology or solution that they're providing. And so they don't tend to do this exploring across let's understand the problem in the way that maybe they would have done 20 years ago. So these sort of models of innovation, I think, are really, really significant for us right now.
I'm thinking about, as we discuss the models of innovation, what I see happening in the world today with generative AI, and it is less about individual ideas versus truly transformative infrastructure to completely change companies. Like, for example, um, uh, the OpenAI's innovation at Microsoft is not one idea. It is infrastructure that fits into every part of the firm. When Bloomberg launched Bloomberg GPT, it is not an individual idea. It is transformative to the entire portfolio of products, and it creates new products. I think sometimes in the past, the way we used to talk about discrete ideas keeps companies away from thinking about transformational infrastructure that is needed to make 100 of these ideas work. So you invest in these islands of ideas, which increases their time to market, increases their cost to market, because the company hasn't made the choice to build infrastructure. It's almost like saying an automobile company that has been selling gas cars all these years to suddenly say, let's have an idea to build an EV versus you have to build a platform so that you can spin off 25 different formats of EVs. I feel like our innovation systems, as you're rightly saying, has to evolve to infrastructure conversations versus idea specific conversations.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fascinating way of thinking about it. And if you think back to why is it that the industrial Internet of Things has taken so long to evolve as a technology, it's partly because we pursued it as being, solving particular use cases rather than thinking about it as a platform of capabilities that you can apply in various different places. The trouble is that sometimes when you take that sort of platform infrastructure approach, it implies a very large investment. And if you don't know the problems it's going to solve, or you don't have the curiosity to learn, you end up potentially with white elephants, which happened in that instance, and we tell one of those stories in the book, right? So it's kind of a how do you attach both to the case for investing in a fundamental shift of capabilities and stay attached to, okay, what are the individual use cases you're going to solve with it, so that the commercialization engine is also as fast as the infrastructure development one. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I'm just trying to think about, again, going back to what you said at the beginning, what needs to be true about the market so that the company can actually make the choice saying, is this a discrete idea? Or do we have to invest in the infrastructure to build out, 25 products or a whole segment in our P&L in 5 years? And I feel like sometimes the companies make the mistake of looking at that new P&L line item as a discrete idea, which means it has to live and die by its own sword. Yeah, so the idea dies, but neither does the company have a new segment of business.
Yeah, and it's a little bit about scale of ambition, right? If you set out a scale of ambition to transform
Right.
a market, which I think is what you're saying, rather than to deliver a particular business, then you think quite differently about those kinds of investment choices, because you're seeing opportunity,
Yeah.
you understand it, you just haven't figured out exactly how to do it yet. And you're going to build the capabilities to do it,
Yeah.
and you're going to keep exploring, testing, learning until you find a place where it's going to succeed.
I really do want to come back to some of the challenges, and indeed, Charles will kill me if I don't come back to me, because he told me to come back to you asking about how you socialized the idea and how you communicated with people, how you didn't raise the corporate antibodies throughout the organization. I want to come back to that, but in the meantime, I have asked many corporate explorers who listen to this show, what would they ask you about succeeding? And they were like kind of saying, and this doesn't make light of it, but ideation and incubation is kind of the easier part. It's when things get serious and you move from explore to exploit that it gets difficult. And that was the questions. How did you move from explore to exploit when the organization goes, okay, there's something in this, go for it, Balaji? And then what type of people did you have to hire? And indeed, how did you have to change your own mindset?
Yeah. So if you think about it again, there are different archetypes of ideas, right? The archetype of idea for Pixel was it would have been most successful. It was integrated into the firm, which meant that I needed to figure out how to make it extremely easy for people to use it. Number one. Number two, I had to communicate that this is not some new mythical being that they need to really understand deeply about how to use it, versus didn't want to communicate how different this is. I only wanted to communicate how this makes their lives easier. For example, when we all started using the internet, my job is to become the browser so that anybody could use external talent and crowdsourcing extremely easily versus trying to explain TCP/IP protocols to everybody. So if you take on that role of making the value proposition easy for them to use in the way that they are used to using, they don't really need to understand in the back there is these nameless, crowd competitions happening, versus you will get similar or same and sometimes better outcomes at lower cost at a faster pace. Isn't that good for you? If the answer is yes, then we will come in, my team will come in, we'll deploy that solution, work with your team and seamlessly integrate so that you can see the speed and be very happy when we deliver work to our clients. So I almost had to hide the difference in the solution in the back end so that they can see the seamless integration and the value to the client in the front end. It does take a little bit of a rethinking, a reimagining of my own ego, that I didn't need to sell this new widget as a way to prove that this is working. As long as it was being used, scaled within the company, that was more important to me than they're recognizing that this is crowdsourcing. That was less important to me, and I think that was important for scale, given the archetype of product, or at least of solution this is.
Brilliant. Andy, do you want to come in on that at all?
Absolutely. There's so much that is in what Balaji talks about on this. I mean, one of them, I love this use of the word architecture. Do you architect it in order to fit the business? Secondly, this notion you were just on, the sort of the value to your clients, or in other businesses, the value to the customer. This is really significant, because what you do is you tap into the motivation of the person whose support or help you need, right? And there's one academic who you should have on your show, if you haven't already, Ron Adner. And Ron does this book on ecosystems, and Ron talks about the adoption chain, right? What are the different steps that goes from the creation of a product to its consumption by its user? And that this is what Balaji faces. He has an adoption chain. He can't take this directly to the full potential of Deloitte's customers, clients. He has to go through the partners with projects, with clients, and he has to present a value proposition to them as well as a value proposition to the end customer. So this sort of attention to the motivation of that intermediary, essentially, is really significant. And then finally, this low ego, right, is the least likely thing to find in an entrepreneur, and the most important thing to the success of a corporate explorer. That at some level, this isn't quite Balaji's situation, I think, but you have to make the senior team think that it's their idea, right? That you don't go around sort of, let me tell you how clever my idea is. You say, hey, I've been listening to what you said, and I realized how brilliant you are. Let me say how I think we can make that happen, right? And this is what corporate explorers do, right? It sounds a little manipulative, but actually it's about working with your investor base in order to get the support you need to realize the ambition. It's just like what it is.
Personally, that's one of the places I fell down big time, where I felt I had to get credit for the idea. And I, even when the idea was starting to succeed, and then the organization who had adopted the idea started to talk about it, I was kind of going, that's my idea. And as I said to Andy the last day, you're better to be a credit maker than a credit taker. And I'm going to tee you up, because I'd love you to share this, because this is where both Charles and Mike said you were brilliant, that you were egoless, you were a brilliant communicator, and you thought about the ecosystem of people you needed to communicate with. I'm going to share that little excerpt where Charles says, you got to come back and talk to Balaji about this. So up on your screen is going to come this little share.
One of the brilliant things about Balaji was his way of not getting in people's faces, of being resilient, of sharing credit. If other people said this was my idea, Balaji was okay with that. And so Andy will talk about kind of some of the things that it takes to be successful as a corporate explorer.
There we go. Over to you, man.
Yeah, I think a couple of things are important. Whenever somebody says this is a great idea and I played a part in it, or I was a sponsor, I funded it, you need a small little village within a large company for any of these to be successful. And just like no one person owns that baby in that time, it takes a village, and you have to say yes to more people that you were fundamental to creating and scaling the business. Because in the end, I don't have equity in the business. So for me, sharing ownership has no cost. So within a large company, share the ownership, share the credit as widely as you can, because it has no implication to true equity, right? And the more people that claim credit for it, it is those people that are on the 80th percentile of adoption. They need these senior people to say it is my idea, because their signals for usage are basically these types of senior executives saying it was my idea. So it is very it makes sense for Pixel to have said yes to each of these times. But equally importantly, corporate explorers often are irrelevant within their own companies, because the company doesn't really know how to treat them. Because you've started something that the company is not good at, there isn't also feedback loops, learning that the company can give you. So the second thing that you have to do as a result, your validation actually comes from outside of the company. It actually comes from other corporate explorers that are building either similar products or building completely something else, but are facing the same problems as you are. And a community of those people are the ones that tell you, yes, you are on the right path, or no, you're not on the right path, because the company cannot do that for you, because the company doesn't truly understand who you are as yet. So I was able to take on a lot of friction, a lot of irrelevance within the company, because I think I built a really good ecosystem of people outside of the firm that told me I was on track. So I'm like, Deloitte will come along, or at least a set of people that are struggling would come along, but also recognizing that some people will never come along. And you don't need to convince everybody in a large company, agnostic of whether it's Deloitte or not, that they need to be part of the journey. 50% of the people might not come along, and that's fine. They're and as you think about that, when the product or the process becomes extremely seamless, it gets integrated into the processes of the firm, they will probably use it without even recognizing it. And I think getting to that point is important.
Can I just echo a little of this, because I think I have a lot of fun at the end of the talks that I do. I have a picture of an astronaut, right, and I point out how the astronauts, the lunar landings, how there were opinion polls showing how the American public were against the Apollo program, how there was a letter to Scientific America from leading scientists saying, Congress cut off funding to NASA, right? In other words, we are often heroes of the new are seen as idiots, sorry, Balaji, or fools before they're successful. And that's the way that corporations instinctively and often unintentionally treat the explorer, right? And the challenge is not to let that get you down, and instead have this kind of somewhat sophisticated approach to building your influence or social network around you, right? So that you really understand who your allies are, who the people you can go to and get access to resources. You talk, Balaji, about those first customers where you were able to take the proof of concept to, and these were your allies, the people who would give you the start that you needed. But you also need advocates. People who are going to speak up for you, because one of the ways that corporations work is that one little piece of bad news travels like wildfire around the organization about what a waste of money this new venture is. And you need people who can stand there and say, wait a minute, actually, I think you need to put that into context, right? I've already heard from the Corporate Explorer about what's going on, and let me tell you what that means, right? But you also need the angel sponsor, the person who's going to commit resources. And one of the things that's interesting when I go around talking to corporate explorers in different companies is that almost never have they really thought systematically about who those people are. They just hope they'll appear, right? They don't think it's part of their job to go find them. But if you were an entrepreneur and you had to go up and down Sand Hill Road to find VC firms, you would know for each VC firm you're going to, the deals that they've signed in the last few years, what their main sort of investment themes are, what kind of their usual partners are in other firms, where their children go to school, where they shop, you'd know everything about them. But you imagine as a corporate explorer, that's not something I need to worry about. It's just not true. You need to be very systematic about how you manage this influence base around you.
And I think it's important to respect the people that say no to you. The firm is 150 years old, or any large company is large because they haven't taken stupid risks at some point in their time. And it's sometimes we look down on that risk averse attitude and think that is not the right thing to do. But I think the reason why these companies, their longevity is directly proportional to their risk averse nature. And I think we talk a lot about startups and how fast do they move, but large companies still contribute 60% of the US GDP. I mean, I can get fact check on that, but they play a big role in the economy, and they provide stability to the economy. And the only way they can do that is not by making bad bets. And as these leaders say no to you, it's not because they hate you as a person. They have a deeply entrenched interest in maintaining and scaling the firm in a steady manner, which is what it needs at that scale. And that is the reason I've never one of the issues that I have with Silicon Valley and the way it innovates is you have this term that I hate vehemently called the incumbent, which is almost as though it is bound to get destroyed, bound to get, startups will come and eat their food. But I think there's a corporate explorers have to do it with greater respect, because your salary, your team, your experimentation is being funded by those so-called boring people living in the past, and you have to respect that a little bit more. And once you deal with them with that respect, that you understand them and where they are coming from, and you're a good steward of the company's money and the firm's money, you get way more latitude than if you are brash and you're fear mongering.
Exactly. And in a sense, it's an empowering message. It means that in any organization, the most likely corporate explorers are those people with more than 10 years of tenure in the company. It's like, those are the explorers, not the folks you hire in from Silicon Valley. Why? Well, because A, they know how to get things done inside the organization. They've probably spent a long time learning what the customer problems are, and they know them deeply, but just feel like we'll never get, there's kind of a moment at which they get impatient and decide, well, let's go for it. Let's see if we can solve this problem. All right. And also the key thing also is they're trusted more, right? So that when Balaji emerges with this idea, they're not trying to isolate, is it the idea that's struggling, or is it Balaji? Is this a good leader, or is this a bad idea? I can't tell. And this is honestly quoted to me by CEOs who decide to fire their newly hired corporate explorers from the outside, is because they couldn't tell the difference. And the corporate explorer from the inside has a much higher success rate. It's not a one-to-one. There are some very successful outside hires, but it's much less likely to succeed.
I was reading about how the Lexus came to life for Toyota, and it only came to life because the executive in charge had a proven track record. And I thought about how difficult it is, because they will often not let that idea come through because somebody has tried something in the past and it didn't work out. Could have been bad timing, could have been the bad team, whatever it might have been, or the organization could have quashed it. So this brings us to this idea of the resilience needed, because I mentioned that term, the pioneers take the arrows. And while you went around and let your ego not take over you, you still would have encountered huge resistance. And I'd love you to maybe talk about how you managed that and managed yourself as well, because it can be quite mentally challenging to go through that type of resistance and ostracization sometimes in an organization.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what I said about the person as well as the business person, right? Um, I knew that this path was going to be tough, but I also knew that I could not connect all of my identity to being a corporate explorer. I would say even today, um, only 40% of my identity is being a Deloitte, partner director. There's unique the counterbalance comes from your own interests as a person that is outside of the company, and the counterbalance comes from your family that you enjoy spending with. So when you have a bad day, when what you wanted to happen doesn't happen, you feel the irrelevance. You have to be able to shut your computer and go back to things that actually make you feel awesome about yourself. And that is important as a business model characteristic, because if your identity is completely connected to it, I feel sometimes you make actually bad choices that make you happy, that might not be the best for scaling of that opportunity or idea. So dealing with frustration is a true skill for corporate explorers, but saying it is not that important is also an important skill. And I think my resilience came from expecting a bunch of failures, expecting a lot of no's, but knowing that I have other interests to fall back on that will give me pride and self-worth. And being a corporate explorer is only one part of my self-worth, not all of it.
It's back to this ego thing. We this phrase about treating sort of victory and failure both as imposters, right, is really important. And you need to be able to have this groundedness. And I was just thinking, when I think of the corporate explorers I know, they're the ones most likely to tell me about their families in a conversation, right? That they, and I'm thinking about Christian Curtis has a daughter, and he talks to me. You've mentioned your family. I feel I pick up your wife's energy on LinkedIn in support of you, right? And I know Yoki Matsuoka has this fabulous large family, which, given how successful she is amazing. And her pet pig, right? And it's actually, there's something about this where the corporate explorer is more community, socially oriented and less self-oriented, right? There's something about that it would be loved to validate with real research.
I mentioned some of the questions I got from corporate explorers, and one of those questions was, okay, I'm now starting to scale and I need to hire people, and I've been used to doing this on my own so far. Who are the key people I need to put in place first?
Yeah, I think one thing that you have to recognize, if you've been with a company long enough, or if you are, a little bit more seasoned, or you have experience, starting a new business like this is going to be a very different experience than, running something that you are very confident at. I would say the best teams that I've had, we were all equals because we were all learning together. If it were a regular consulting project that I've done, rinsed and repeated many, many times, I knew what to tell the team to say, if you follow this path, there's a greater chances for success versus if you follow another path. With a new business like this, I had no clue which path would be successful and which path won't be successful. Second, it's a constant learning from the team, because they're on the front lines dealing with either the technology team, dealing with the customers, dealing with the firm. and you're learning from them. They are your sources of learning. But your biggest role in many ways is to manage frustration of your team members, because they are feeling that irrelevance as much, if not more, than you. Second, you have to stand back as a fallback, so that when they fail or when their experiments go awry, it is your fault, not their fault. Third is an ability to bring people that make you uncomfortable with the status quo. I had a couple of team members that were so hard on me and so hard on the business because they wanted excellence and they wanted to prove that this could scale, this could be bigger, even than my own ambition. And ensuring that you are basically a path or a channel for them to bring their energy and their passion is another job that you do. Hierarchy is probably the worst thing to bring in till the idea is at some scale and you can actually put in structure. Until then, all of these people are equal, and I would say they actually know more about the business than you would ever do. And your job and your role and identity changes very significantly from the last 20 years of experience that you've had, from the time that you start a new business within a large company.
Brilliant, man. That's brilliant. So last question I have for you then is your message for a corporate explorer. So when people are facing this, a huge proportion of our show are corporate explorers or trying to drive change within an organization, or a startup founder, or indeed a CEO or a COO or of an organization trying to be the head of transformation. And the road is rocky. Like we have to admit that. But what is your message for them? A message of encouragement?
I would say the most important message is a corporate explorer has to feel the agency that they can make the change happen. Has to feel the agency and confidence and passion that they believe in a different future or an adjacent future for their firm. And they have to lead with that belief in dealing with all the setbacks and dealing with who needs to agree with that vision. But it starts with their own confidence and their own feeling of agency that I can do this. I think this is the right thing for my firm, that I'm assuming they still like and they love, that this is the right answer for them. And going back to the startup comparison, our economy, our world runs primarily on large companies, and their ability to shift and change is critical for the world that we live in. While we always look with rose-tinted glasses at startups, the economy works on large companies, and their ability to change their own company has a bigger impact on the world than startups that only one among 20 actually survive to a Series C. So feel the agency, feel the role that you want to create within the company and the impact that you have in the world. And for the right types of ideas, the company is a better channel to get there than than starting on your own. But also know when the company is a liability, that too much is stacked against the idea for it to be successful. And that's when you quit and start your own firm as well.
It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, the corporate explorer in the flesh, Balaji Bondili, and indeed the author of The Corporate Explorer, Andrew Binns. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Aidan. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Aidan. It's been a pleasure to spend some time with you and with Balaji, the hero of Chapter 5.
Thanks as always to Gate 1 and Gate 1 Incubator that supports its own team to become founder investors in a growing portfolio of startup opportunities. You can find Gate 1 at gate1consulting.com.